Uh, yeah, let's start. I saw this video by Studio Birul, and it is about female white knights. So, Sandman and other MGTOWs started this concept in which they talked about the women who would appear to side with the men. But Sandman and others believed that most probably these women were looking after their own interests. Why Sandman would say that, what would be his reasoning, is evident from his videos. This video is a partial response to Sandman's claim about women not being completely honest when they try to side with men's issues. This video is old, it is from 2016, January 21. But I thought of responding to this video because of certain factual claims that Sandman makes, which I agree with and which this video disagrees with. And so we will analyze this video and look what information can we gain from the other side. So we'll watch this video and we'll stop at the points we believe that are worthy of addressing, and we generally would follow a faster route in traveling through this video, only making pauses at crucial points. So let's start.
Happy New Year! I'm Janice Fiamingo of the University of Ottawa, and my theme today is on being a female white knight. Recently, I came across a video by Sandman called Female White Knights, posted on December 15th, 2015. Sandman is a MGTOW philosopher. For anybody who doesn't know, MGTOW is a movement in which men go their own way, refusing to allow deference to women to define their identities and goals.
This is the very important point that MGTOW stress. MGTOW is not about a certain following a certain lifestyle over the other. The most will agree that marriage in general in this society is a bad thing. It is about not letting females define masculinity. Why is that? Well, while it is true to a certain extent that our behavior and the expectation from us is defined by the people who do not belong to that particular set or group. The features of a person's behavior are defined by the people outside of the group. This is a general fact. However, over the years in the dialectic that has emerged, one key thing that has been noticed is that for most of these groups, this dialectic became important wherein they sought to define themselves according to their own terms. Remember, this is not hyper individualism, in which an individual is defined based on what he or she himself feels or herself feels about himself or herself. It could be about a collective, but that collective consciousness must arise from the group itself. That uh, dialectic does not cater to the truth as much because it would always remain a fact that a person's behavior would be defined by the people around the person. However, owing to the emergence of dialectics within the people themselves, group of the people themselves, it has become quite clear that the future as it is for the relations between the groups and the relations between the members of a particular group would evolve based on the dialectic present inside the group to a greater extent than the dialectic present outside the group. This is the reason why, for example, you see that the categories like femininity or Any of the racial categories or any of the categories that describe sexual orientation or gender orientation seek to define themselves by the content, conduct, and the opinion of the members of the group themselves. This is a stark contrast from the uh, other groups defining the behavior and the expectation from that particular group. The men uh, of the MGTOW movement believe that because a group can be defined intellectually, in abstract, at the very least, using biology and psychology as a means for explaining the behavior of the people, the definition of the group could be ascertained by the individuals who can commit to this intellectual task, and thus the biased and motivated assessment by the other groups of the men is not needed when the things like the science and reasoning can replace them to offer a more objective view of the group.
In the video, Sandman warns his MGTOW viewers that female men's rights advocates should be regarded with a healthy degree of skepticism, or perhaps best ignored. They may do some good. In fact, he readily admits that Karen Straughn's videos help to kickstart a lot of his thinking. But such women are also looking out for their own self interests and are therefore not to be completely trusted. Sandman notes that ironically, women have privilege in the manosphere as everywhere else, and many of them say nothing that male anti feminists haven't already said, yet are enthusiastically praised for saying it and end up stealing the spotlight despite the lesser risk involved in their public statements.
Uh, the concept of women having privilege is a very popular concept among the manosphere, and this concept emerges from an analysis of the society as it is. From the perspective of the evolution, uh, when the humans were more like the animals or the beasts, both the men and the women would have certain traits that would gain them advantage over the other. For example, the men would have a higher strength, which would allow them to have uh, a greater degree of control over the woman. The woman would have several traits themselves that would help them to gain advantages over the men. Two of them being the fact that there is a greater empathy among both men and women towards the woman, and women can use their sexual desirability to turn people towards them. Both of these factors give women power. As a society develops and becomes more civilized, the power of the men greatly decreases because any act of exertion of power over the woman is now a crime in most of the cases. In fact, in all of the cases, even if not all of the cases are of male violence towards the females are brought to the justice. However, it is very unlikely to have a public forum, at least in the West, in which someone can brag about hitting or killing or performing an act of violence towards a woman without a censure. So males mostly have lost their ability to have an advantage over the woman in many regards. On the other hand, this very same civilized society places a great deal of concern over the people who are considered weak, and thus the factors in which the empathy is aroused for these people have been greatly exaggerated. Also, the sexual desirability of the woman have reached peak levels because of a general sexually accepting climate of the West. So the power of the female has increased drastically, while the power of the males has reduced to very low levels. This is the reason we see that this society acts differently than the societies of the earlier eras, whether they be agricultural societies or the hunter gatherer societies. This is mostly due to the socio-economic factors, but this is a part of the cycle that all civilizations go through. And in this phase of this civilization, owing to a large number of pleasures and goods available, the value of the male labor and male ingenuity has become a lot less because we are not living in dire times that we need males to benefit our society. There are a lesser number of wars, there is less poverty, and there is a massive welfare system, and thus the importance of males has drastically gone down. On the other hand, because of the pleasure oriented climate, the power of the females has gone up because both the sexual and the empathetic orgasms, so as to speak, can be achieved, which give pleasure to the mind. A person can be hero if he defends a woman who is generally perceived as weak, and a person would gain an access to sex if he tries to, or if he defends the woman, because he can gain the appreciation of the woman. Now, how much of that actually happens in practice is a thing that can be debated. However, what is quite clear as something which feminists, traditionalists, and the leftists would agree is that women now have more power than they had before. Now, from that perspective, the concept of women's privilege becomes pretty important and pretty evident. This women's privilege is thus not only seen in the places where the women are less than the men, because it would be a general or simple issue of supply and demand, but this is also present in the societies where you would see that while the number of the females and the males is equal, a greater emphasis is placed by the government on the female because the government justifies itself by taking care of the supposed weak. As such, the general societal direction is in upliftment and empowerment of the woman, even in the West. So, coming from that perspective, the Sandman's point about it seems a little more legitimate. Let's move on further.
Some of these are youngish women looking for male adulation, Sandman speculates. Some are looking to hedge their bets, in a sense, to form allegiance with the men's rights movement in case feminist society collapses even sooner than expected. Some of these women, having benefited from feminism for a good part of their lives, are now concerned about their sons or about their own status in old age. It's nearly impossible, according to Sandman, for women to be the altruistic allies of men that they claim to be and for which a lot of men have offered grateful acknowledgement.
And this is also a very crucial point. Can women be altruistic towards men? From the perspective of the evolutionary uh, psychology, one can argue that it is very unlikely to be the case for the simple reason that the way the women have developed is to maximize their value because they are carriers of the pregnancy. They are the carriers of the next generation. Thus, women's actions are directed towards their self. Now, one can say that it is because of the will, or one can say that it is because of the biology. But in either case, the fact remains that the way women think about the society is how, in this society, they can at least perform uh, as great as the other people. They try not to try not to be worse off than the other people in the society. And this psychology perhaps comes from the uh, fact that women, because they carry the next generation, have this innate tendency to look after their own safety and look after their own well being. In fact, this is the key indicator of the modern day feminism, and this has been the key indicator of the earlier traditionalism as well. Because if you look at, for example, just the statistics involving workplace fatalities, you will see that while as the societies have developed and become the so called more egalitarian, more women have entered the workforce, but still men comprise most of the workplace fatalities. And the reason for that is women do not choose to go in those works or in those spheres of the uh, work which are far more dangerous. And that is because the woman's attitude towards the work is different than the men's attitude towards the work. When women are trying to work, they are not looking at the work in the same way as the men are, and this is the reason why men and women are choosing different types of work. The very difference in the choices that men and women make as a group reflects some sort of deep psychology acting behind their actions.
More serious than women's dubious motives and the undeserved praise that they receive is the effect of female white knighting on men, especially young men. The danger, as Sandman sees it, is that these anti feminist women will convince men in the MGTOW movement that all hope is not lost, that the long gender Cold War of the past 50 to 100 years can be called off, and that all they really need to do is search for an anti feminist woman. But this is no different, according to Sandman, from the case of a lion who surprisingly gives up attacking a herd of zebras and starts defending the zebras, even attacking other lions to do so. The zebras are ecstatic, of course, thinking they've got a wonderful protector in the lion, and as a result, they get complacent. And in the end, this just makes the zebras even more vulnerable. Their lion protector, once the other lions have been vanquished, will turn on the zebras and dispatch them with great ease. Inherent in the analogy is the point Sandman goes on to spell out. Women might disguise their natures, but that nature is always the same, to take advantage of men, to prey on them, essentially.
It is worth pointing out that one of the good things about the MGTOWs is that they are looking towards essentialism as the key doctrine instead of existentialism. And as such, the nature of the species and the human beings matter a lot while making a decision about what is the role of the people and how they would act in a particular situation. This difference between the males and the females is thus based, as Sandman would argue, on the biological facts, and this is very hard to counteract.
Female white knights are still women, after all, and can't help but use men's advocacy in their own interests. It's a compelling argument and an unverifiable one, focusing on such murky regions of the psyche as motive and unconscious desires. The sweeping claim about women's nature cannot be defeated, except perhaps by responding with another sweeping claim, which is that merely wishing really hard that men can stop wanting love and approval from women doesn't seem likely to make it happen. It is true, in my opinion, that female anti feminists are given a far easier ride than male ones, and that men tend to shower praise on those few women who publicly call out the injustice of feminism. Those facts in themselves, however, do not necessarily mean either that women who want to expose an unjust ideology are necessarily playing a double game, or that male recognition of women's support will weaken the MGTOW movement unless MGTOW prohibits any friendly feeling of men towards women.
So we have two claims here. First of all, the claim is that the women who are trying to defend men are not playing the a double game. And the second is that the inclusion of the woman in the MGTOW movements and the manosphere would not weaken the manosphere. These are the two claims based on which we would analyze this video because these are the central claims. So let's move on and look at our arguments.
Now, without attempting to engage with the overall argument of Sandman, I want to think a bit about his claim in relation to my own white knighting, to explore whether my anti feminist advocacy is grounded in self interest. Of course, if I'm a master of deception, as he suggests, then everything I say here should be taken with a grain of salt. On one level, the claim about self interest doesn't fit me that well. I'm a middle aged woman with a secure academic position in a completely feminist dominated environment. I have nothing to gain professionally and some friendships and career opportunities to lose for breaking with feminism. I already have a fantastic, super smart, and sexy husband who, although supportive of whatever I do, would be just as happy if I focus my energies on other subjects. I don't have any children to worry about, and although I would love for my friend Steve to profit from his work documenting the misandry of our time, I don't expect to make any money at it. I'm not under any illusions about my personal charisma when I speak as an anti feminist, and actually, when I rewatch the few lectures I've given, my toes curl at my deer in the headlights performance. So, on professional and personal levels, my anti feminism isn't particularly in my interest.
So this is kind of an argument which comes from a sort of a single anecdote, but a personal anecdote nonetheless. And that anecdote perhaps can be verified to some extent. The problem here is though pretty same. First of all, the claim that the women who are helping the men or defending the men are playing a double game does not necessarily apply to all the women. This is the reason why Sandman says that one should be skeptical of these women and not outright reject them. But it is very, very, very likely that such women are like that, and thus our first instinct should be to have a attitude of rejection towards them. So one anecdote doesn't count for anything among half of the female population in this world of billions of people. However, let's analyze this. This argument about there'd be no self-interest among a particular woman in defending men's rights stems from a very surface analysis of motivations of the people. Just look at a counter example. Why would you think a man who has a wife and he has no intent of just cheating on her or having sex with other women would defend women uh, in a particular context, even when it seems that his defense is unjustified? The answer to that is pretty easy because of certain impulses that we all have in our psyche. If we look at the history of feminism, we see that there are many men who, on the top, who supported these women and fought for their rights. Was it true that every one of these men had the personal self-interests in the same way, in the same material way as she is talking about? It hardly seems believable that such would be the case. That people at the top positions who can have uh, sexual relations with many beautiful women because they have a lot of money and they have a lot of status, they need to pander to feminism in order to impress women. But they still did that because of an internal motivation. The question here is not about the self interest in the material sense per se. The question here is about the thinking. Is the woman's thinking about defending males arising out of a genuine empathy for the males and understanding of the male centric uh, system which McToss talk about, or it is arising out of someplace else? And to understand that, we would allow her to talk a little more.
But on another level, Sandman is absolutely right. I'm a white knight for men because I want to be one and I'm doing it for me. I don't want to live any longer in a culture in which I and most people submit to lies about women's victimization and male privilege. It feels crazy and sick. I particularly don't want to live in a society in which every time I open a newspaper, I have to suppress a roar of disgust because there's yet another womanly demand for special privileges or government sponsored perks or more complaints, jealousies, and resentment directed at men. Just the other day, it was an article by Leah McLaren, a columnist at the Globe and Mail, one of Canada's national newspapers, about how women should be paid for what she called women's, quote, emotional labor. Things like sending thank you cards or ordering something online for her child. That's emotional labor, which she says is the next feminist frontier. Pretty soon, it seems, feminists will be marching in the street to demand that men's tax dollars fund doulas and birthing coaches to help women grunt and pant their way through such heroic exertions as phoning a neighbor to thank her for loaning a cup of sugar. I feel a wave of nausea coming on just thinking of it. You see, I'm at the point where I can hardly bear to read newspapers without fear of apoplectic fit. I definitely don't want to spend the next 20 or 30 years or however much longer I have left on this earth in a society that gives women permission, really encourages women, almost mandates them to be at their worst. Selfish, hypocritical, superficial, amoral, mean spirited, manipulative, and vindictive. It's not good for my self respect as a woman. I don't want to live in a culture that turns women into raging children, supposedly too scared to attend an astronomy conference or even walk down the street for fear of sexual harassment, but not too scared to lecture men on their evil, berate them, slander them, belittle them, and call for yet more laws and policies to make their lives more difficult. In addition to the discrimination they already face in hiring, employment, family court, healthcare, reproductive rights, educational opportunities, government services, military conscription, etc. I fear it's all turning me into a raving misogynist, and that can't be good for my mental health. I don't want to spend the remainder of my teaching career watching the girls in my classes become ever more inclined to blame every personal failure or ordinary life setback or challenge on, quote, institutionalized sexism, while the boys become ever quieter, more apathetic, more unsure of themselves, more awkward, apologetic, ashamed, sad, angry, and adrift. It's painful and infuriating to witness, and I suspect that one day soon I might go ballistic and launch into a gynophobic tirade in my class that will lead to my being forced to take a series of sensitivity workshops and issue a public apology.
Uh, I would presume that this was some kind of an argument. Now, let's analyze this argument. Most of what this argument said could be imagined to be a male saying the very same or similar things uh, 30 to 40 years back, but just talking about the men instead of the women. We talk about how he does not want men to become selfish, entitled, to have privilege, and he would support the women precisely for that reason, because he wants men to be better. All of this emotional talk actually has zero impact on the logical analysis that one would undertake in order to accept or reject Sandman's views. So let's perform a logical analysis. The society that was promised by the people in charge and the people who were working in the bottom, the public at large, was about egalitarianism. It was the belief that men and women were equal. It was not a belief in female supremacy. It was also not a belief in the fact that females should run everything, at least from the public standpoint. People would often talk about the evolution of these liberal movements, but one of the main important points of these liberal movements, at least in theory, was the fact that men and women were to be treated equal. So how did we arrive at this situation? Why we ended up in this place? Why we have such discriminations as she talks about? Why we have this sense of entitlement and privilege among the women? The problem is not the women per se. The problem is not the men per se. The problem is the structure of the society itself. When a man is looking at this society, he does not want that there be accommodations for him. He also does not want that there be some sort of an equal balance between men and women. And the reason for that is because that is not possible. Because there are differences between men and women. No matter how much you try, you would never achieve them. Because egalitarianism is a lie. So working in that direction is obviously flawed. What the people are seeing when they are looking at these things is the fact that people are creating a society based on their own emotions, which would eventually lead to its doom. And MGTOW celebrate that fact, not in a very happy way, but in a sad way, but still celebrate it because it is something that is necessary in order to prove that the current understanding of the society is wrong. There is no other means to do that. One can talk about individual things like discriminations in hiring. One can talk about individual things like the sense of entitlement that the women face. One can mock women complaining about manspreading or mansplaining or getting paid for emotional labor. But all of this achieves nothing. The question here is why all of this is taking place. And the reason is because the public looks at men and the women differently. Egalitarianism is a giant lie. And thus, anyone who is working towards a sort of egalitarian society is either too naive and thus unable to adjust with the man's way or deceptive. And this is a logical argument that is being made. It does not involve, as she says, an analysis into the motivations of the people to that may help. It involves looking at the arguments that the people are making, trying to analyze them, and seeing whether they hold, whether they are logically consistent, whether they are achievable. This is not different than analyzing a Marxist making a statement. When a Marxist is making a statement, you do not know whether the Marxist is subverting the social order or not. But what you can do is look at his ideology and see whether it holds the ground. And then you have to make a decision whether the person who is speaking is ignorant, that he does not see that, or is deceptive. The second thing to talk here is also very interesting. Think of it like this. There was a period in which people would say that there were good women, a traditional era where women were not as entitled or felt as much privileged. She also believes that it appears because she says that feminism is partly responsible for making women feel entitled or privileged. If that is the case, her point should be that earlier, before this feminist era, wherever she believes that the feminism has gone wrong, women were actually good, honest, and caring about the other people as well. But if that was really the case, if women were really like that, then how did we come here? How can a society in which power is held by the people, most of whom are good, lead to a situation in which the societal collapse is imminent because of the internal factors in the society themselves? Even when we have so many tools for analyzing uh, psychology and biology that differentiates men and women, why, with more science, it is it appears that the society is on its verge of collapse? If people are so good, so honest, and so wanting to preserve the civilization? Well, the answer to that question is obvious. There is no way one can come from a non feminist society to a feminist society without the help from the woman. It is just impossible. And this is the point that McDowell's make. The idea that there was some group of vocal women who forcibly shoved feminism down their throats of most of the women and all of the men is so hilarious and so naive that it could only be construed as deceptive unless one believes that the females who are arguing for this theory are completely ignorant, so ignorant that they wouldn't even realize an inherent soft contradiction in what they are speaking of. Can, in this society, one get women who are better than the hypothetical old traditionalist woman? Unless one believes that the answer is yes, one is trying to forward a theory that is bizarre. Because if even one creates a society that defeats feminism and a sense of entitlement and privilege among the women, why it won't happen again? We have come from an era where feminism was not there. So why we cannot go back again to that era even after we defeat feminism? What is the thing that would separate those two cycles? What would be the difference between those two cycles? That is the logical question. that needs asking. And that defines the theory that one is forwarding of the society and the dynamics between men and women.
On the other hand, when I see or hear about guys being guys, whether that's working in a science lab or on a construction site, doing amazing stunts on their bicycles or guitars, fixing things, telling jokes, playing sports, teaching classes, parenting their children, being masculine. I like their energy and I want it in the world, whether that has anything to do with me personally or not. Furthermore, it's definitely in my self interest to live in a sane world, a world in which the most talented, capable, and hardworking people, often men as it turns out, are in charge. A world that holds me and other women to a standard of achievement rather than giving us top jobs and special perks just because we're women. I want all the perks done away with for good because they're a moral hazard to me and to all women. Most fundamentally, I don't want to live in a world that makes me so disgusted and repulsed by the behavior of my own sex that it forces me to wonder whether I'm really a selfish, narcissistic monster, too. There sure do seem to be a lot of nasty narcissists out there, enabled by a society gone mad over poor woman hysteria. When I read that a recent American survey found that 44% of college women don't believe a nod of agreement is sufficient to count as sexual consent. In other words, that a woman who nodded to the boy she's making out with can later claim she was raped. When I read about cases such as that involving Cassandra Kennedy, who lied about her father sexually abusing her to punish him, and only admitted her lie after her father spent 9 years in jail, and nothing is going to happen to her because, you guessed it, if she were punished, it might prevent other liars from coming forward to put their innocent fathers in jail. When I read about a woman, Tiffany Stevens, getting off with a probationary sentence for paying a man to kill her husband and who still retains custody of their child, when I see a statement by a wealthy woman named Diane Smith Gander, CEO of a company called Transfield in Australia, stating with relish that well qualified men will simply have to lose their jobs to make it possible for all government boards to have 50% female representation. When she has the nerve to say of the men, they're not going to want to lose their gig, and that's a sad and sorry thing, but that's just the way it is. When I read this and so much more, I am sickened and humiliated and almost totally turned off by the female half of humanity.
And this is perhaps the flashpoint of the difference. The number of issues that we saw being talked about reek of a common theme. The question here is that lying is still not believed good in this world, nor it is believed that people should lose jobs, nor it is believed that sexual crimes are uh, so less of a crime that uh, a simple nod would still not count as an agreement. There is no philosophy behind all of these happenings. These things are not happening because of a particular logical viewpoint. And this is where McDowell's come into the picture. It is not because there is a sort of a female supremacist movement that is going on, which is leading to all of these factors being present in the society. It is something else. And this world offers us an opportunity to look into these things and derive conclusions about the nature of these things and the nature of men and women. The hazard in allowing uh, the world to change and become more egalitarian is that it would be just a superficial fix to the problems of the world and would prevent us from analyzing these situations and making conclusions about the real nature of the world. It would prevent us from making observations about things as they are, but it would create a society in which moral imperatives of the people are better expressed and better balanced with the preferences of the people. This society may seem like an ideal society, a very good society, but this society is actually the very reason why we are ended up in the first place in this situation. Because none of those two factors have anything to do with the truth, but only to the morality and to the likings and disliking of the people. As such, this society is ever in the state of flux and transition and is very volatile. It could change in any direction and goes back and forth. Such a society would firstly not be stable, but even if it was stable, it would not be aligned to truth, and thus there would always be a scope of looking at and analyzing the situations logically, and thus the need of the MGTOWs would persist in such a society. MGTOWs have not formed just because men's conditions have deteriorated to such a point, but they've also formed because there is a very deep seated analysis that could be made about the world, which could point out flaws in the way the world works. And even after these flaws are addressed by some bandages, they would only remove the symptoms and not the causes. For this reason, for this dialectic is important, and this dialectic does not point to a more egalitarian world, but a world in which a sort of individualism of the men is maintained along with the group sense in a way that is distanced from the woman. For example, why we are ended up in a situation where a norm in agreement to have sex is not considered to be appropriate enough to have a consensual sex by so many people, even though the term consent itself carries with it the affirmation or a noun in its very meaning. Why we have reached this place? The answer is obvious because men and women do not see sex in a similar way, and forcibly making the standard more rigid and in favor of men wouldn't change that fact. It would only put a bandage on the symptom, even if it works. It would only put the bandage on the symptom. It would not address the root cause.
Thank God for Karen and Daphne and Janet and others. Ultimately, I just don't want the horror of seeing men crippled in the way feminism has crippled them. I can't be who I want to be in the world if that's being done to men. So I guess I do want to use men in the men's movement for my own interests. Whether it's through MGTOW or men's rights, it's up to you. But yes, I definitely want you to take back your lives and power and your pride for me because I will enjoy that selfishly.
Cringe. So we are done essentially here, and we have covered almost all the grounds. So let's end this video right here. But before that, let's look at the key point. What is the important thing that is being said here? What is the most important takeaway from this video? The most important takeaway from this video is that over the years, people have realized, at least a certain section of it, that there is a very deep seated differentiation that persists in the mind of the public with regards to the male and the females, and a sort of egalitarianism, even that which is true in its very nature, would either be not stable, and if it is stable, would still be very far away from the truth. It is not a society, unlike the society of the old, where there were concrete gender roles, where there was an understanding of how the men and women behaved, even if it was wrong. This society was established on the principle of egalitarianism, Imagine a society, a Muslim society, which is based supposedly on the Sharia law. But that Sharia law is not even practiced in public, even in the law. It is not just that the Muslims are acting hypocritically in their rooms. It is not just that the law has a lot of problems and the justice is not being met in many situations according to the law. It is that the law is problematic on the public level as well. Because even while the people are saying that they believe in the Quran and the Sharia law, they are not practicing it even in the public, even in the front of the many peoples. Why would that situation happen? What would cause that situation? Well, the only reason why the situation would be caused is if the people who are advocating for the Sharia law or who say that they believe in Sharia law to any extent are being deceptive. And this is the problem with the society of the West as well. People who say that they are egalitarian are not actually egalitarian. They are looking at these situations at the best in a way that they would balance the morality with the preferences. But this is not an adequate way of looking at the world. The world should be looked at in a logical sense, because that would offer us the maximal amount of information about the world and would allow us to make the best decisions. Over the years, men have seen these differences crop out so often that they have decided, a few of them at the very least, to make an analysis into the nature of the world and deconstruct the sexes. And as such, both the men and the women, both the masculine and the feminine, are deconstructed. Obviously, a section of the people do not like that because once the feminine is being deconstructed, the whole situation, the whole game changes. People are now, would now look at if such a movement becomes successful at females in a very different light as they look at males in a very different light because they have certain stereotypical beliefs about the males, whether those beliefs are true or not. This analysis has thus become very important because it points out how much truth is important. The society that preached egalitarianism stopped practicing egalitarianism because people sought to compromise with the women, or to say, compromise among different groups. But if they had stuck true to their guns and would have advanced truth before the balancing of morality and preferences, such a situation would have never arisen because an analysis into the truth would reveal a lot of information about the genders, both the genders that would be detrimental to them. And as such, there would be a negative belief about both the genders. The situation here is not to create a balanced, good, livable society because the standard would be different according to different people. While one may say here that these women are wrong, these women who the woman in the video is talking about as as exercising their privilege and getting away with after even doing something wrong. These men obviously believe that they are right. So how do we decide? It's all a subjective arena. And the reason uh, for the analysis that involves logic is precisely because in a situation where all the dialectics of the old have broken down, there are no rules for looking at things that are agreed among the masses. And thus a new system has to be developed. And that system has to be developed based on the truth as its foundation. And only then the system would live long. And for that reason, mentors are necessary. And for that reason, female involvement in manosphere is discouraged.